안녕하십니까. 다시 아빠 입니다.
All right, I think it is time for us to get started. Thank you all so much for coming. I am incredibly excited to see all of the people here tonight, and thank you for tuning in at 8 p.m. if you're in Eastern time. But I'm curious to know where everyone is signing in from. So if you are able to, if you could just type in the chat where you are coming in from, I would love to see where everybody is at. Oh, wow, all over. So we have Korea, Oxford, China, Boston, Decatur, Washington State, San Diego, Shanghai, Atlanta, Toronto. Oh my goodness, there's so much international representation in here tonight. I'm so happy that everyone was able to make it. This is just amazing. New York City, Emory Student Center, okay, nice. Georgia, okay, well, I had suspected we'd be having an audience from around the world, but I'm just so excited to see that we have people truly just across the world coming in to engage in these great discussions tonight. So thank you again so much for coming. This event is brought to you tonight by Regeneration Movement, which is the organization I'm a part of. My name is Mary. I'm the Director of Planning and Development at Regeneration Movement, a nonprofit organization that is passionate about peacemaking and global citizenship. And that's a mission that we pursue through running educational programs in Decatur, Georgia for youth and organizing events for advocacy and hosting events like these where diverse individuals can share ideas and enter discussions about issues related to peace. And we are also co-hosting this event tonight with the East Asia Collective at Emory University. So I'm going to go ahead and let Emory's East Asia Collective President, I-Ching Hu, introduce East Asia Collective.
Hi guys, East Asia Collective is a student organization dedicated to create a free space for student and faculty discussions on issues in East Asia of social, cultural, political importance. So things we do include inviting professors or professionals in the field to speak in our panel talks or to join our discussions, and sending out weekly newsletters on current events in East Asia and hosting weekly table talks where students casually discuss East Asian issues. So we hope you enjoy this event.
Yes, I want to echo that. I hope that you enjoy this event. I am so excited to hear the diverse opinions and perspectives on what we're going to be discussing tonight. And of course, our amazing guest speakers. So before we get started, I want to ask that everyone during the talks, please use the chat box if you have any questions. And there's going to be a Q&A session after the talks where we'll be able to address your questions and enter into a more free discussion about the topic. So to briefly introduce the topic, as you all know, the title of our talk today is Black-Korean Conflict and Solidarity. In this talk, we are going to explore how Korean Americans and Black Americans, two racial minority groups that have been systemically kept apart from each other and at times even pitted against each other within the United States racial hierarchy, have come together in complex transactional interactions in commerce, popular culture, and activism. And at the core of our discussion tonight is inquiry into the possibilities and challenges for solidarity and productive engagement between these two communities amidst conflict, sometimes conflicts of interests and systemic injustice. And I'm so excited for our amazing guest speakers. So to briefly introduce our guest speakers, our first presentation tonight is going to be from Dr. Joo Young Lee, and the name of her presentation is Black Korea in Global Media from 1992 to 2020. So Dr. Joo Young Lee is a core faculty member of Asian Pacific Islander American Studies and a lecturer of American culture at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Her research interests include race and mixed race in film and media, the visual history of Afro-Asian relations, literary and cinematic encounters between the United States and South Korea. Her research on visual representations of mixed race Black Koreans has been recognized by the Wangari Maathai Essay Award in 2015 and the Ralph Henry Gabriel Prize nomination in 2018. Her teaching has also been recognized by the Outstanding Graduate Student Instructor Award in 2016 and the Golden Apple Awards nomination in 2020. She was a visiting scholar at Hanyang University in Seoul, South Korea in 2015 and served as the National Center for Institutional Diversity as a postdoctoral fellow in 2018 to 2019. And in recognition of her dedication to diversity and equity, she was selected as a member of the Diversity Scholars Network and Bouchet Honor Society. So we are so thrilled to be able to welcome her tonight and to be able to listen to her presentation. And after that, we're going to hear from Dr. Jenny Wong Medina. And Dr. Jenny Wong Medina is an assistant professor of modern and contemporary Korean literature, visual media, and culture at Emory University. And her research focuses on issues of national and global cultures, diaspora, translation, race, and ethnicity. And Dr. Wong Medina has been an amazing mentor and teacher to me over the years. So I am particularly excited and thrilled that she's able to be here tonight and to be able to listen to her amazing insights on these issues. So the title of her presentation is Mr. and Mrs. Kim with the Good Hair, Decentering Whiteness in the Ethnic Hair and Beauty Supply Industry. So we have a wide range of topics, all through which we're going to be able to discuss these greater themes and enter into discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and give the floor to Dr. Joo Young Lee to hear her presentation.
All right, thank you, Mary. So I'm going to share my screen as I prepared a PowerPoint for all of us. All right, so I would like to thank Regeneration Movement and East Asia Collective at Emory University for inviting me to join this talk today. And I also would like to thank all the participants here tonight, from community members to high school students, undergrad and graduate students, to the scholars located in multiple countries, spaces, and different time zones. So in my presentation, there will be some content warning and some language that is kind of violent. So I'm going to give a hint before it comes up. Please understand those kind of content warning. So for today's talk, I would like to define Black Korea as a literal and figurative space where there are multiple intimate, conflicted, and even unstable relations are born, produced, reproduced, and transformed continuously. That encompasses mixed raceness, the Black diaspora in Korea, and the Korea diaspora in the Black community in the United States, as well as economic and political exchanges. So for my talk, I'm going to navigate the political and social realm, specifically within the context of the Los Angeles riot of 1992 to the George Floyd case of 2020, represented in film and media materials. So in 2020, we saw two disparaging images of Black-Korean relations. Since the death of George Floyd, the pre-existing Black Lives Matter, which started back in 2013 when Trayvon Martin was shot dead for wearing a hoodie, resurfaced publicly and widely televised and mediatized due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Those global citizens who believe in anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and anti-violence joined the movement as we saw Black Lives Matter, 흑인의 목숨도 중요하다, in South Korea. Along with it, the K-pop fans joined the digital media platform in their fight against the anti-Black sentiments when Texas Dallas PD asked for the social media users to post the photos of illegal activism on its Twitter account, as you saw the captured image of Texas Dallas PD's Twitter. Then we saw how K-pop fans blow a strike for the Black Lives Matter by posting images and GIFs on Texas Dallas PD's Twitter. We saw lots of K-pop GIFs on that Twitter account after Texas PD wanted to capture illegal images. The new generation, your generation, who grew up with the social media since the birth of YouTube and Facebook in 2005, are more adept with the media activism, not only within the national border, but widely online and offline. Nevertheless, we cannot say that this global age, supported by the technology of platforms and devices, transformed the racial tensions existed between Black and Korea, either nation, race, or ethnicity, as exemplified by the recent incident happened to Sam Ochiri. Sam Ochiri, a Guinean living in South Korea and working as a TV persona, excoriated blackface used by Korean high school students. And then he received a backlash from online and offline people in South Korea. Therefore, it is imperative to navigate where, when, and how did this conflict between the Black diaspora and the Korean diaspora start? What is the role of media and popular culture in the process of Black Korean conflict and solidarity? If we decenter white-centered, imperialist, colonialist sentiments, are we able to move away from this racial binary opposition between Black and Korea, or racial triangulation among Black and Asia and white are put in opposite side to support and undergird white supremacy and white privilege? Therefore, the objective of this talk is twofold. First, I would like to navigate the cause of this conflict between Black and Korea through the lens of media representations. And then second, I would like to envision a way to solidify our division. So whenever we think of the Black Korean conflict, we always refer to the Los Angeles riot, as many documentary films and televised media clips recorded, replayed, reproduced this story. Many view the Los Angeles riot as a moment that revealed the conflict between Black and Korea. By looking at this as a momentum, people often blame the white supremacy and police violence against Rodney King that fueled the riot among African Americans in California and nationwide. However, I would like to rewind our timeline here a little bit back, in order to think more about the deeply rooted conflict between two groups in the United States, Black and Korea. Before the Rodney King case in 1991 and the Los Angeles riot of 1992, there was the 18-month protest and boycott against the family-owned Red Apple store in New York in 1990. So everything started with some limes, peppers, and other veggies. The Haitian immigrant woman, Giraine Petitsaint, was shopping at the store, the Red Apple, and then she was in the ambulance after a fervent dispute between her and the owner of the Red Apple. Bloodsuckers was the epithet that we heard in the protest against the Korean immigrants. Not only the Jang family, the owners of the Red Apple, but also other small store owners and employees in Queens and Brooklyn, New York. As much as Korean merchants were blamed for being ignorant and racist, Black shoppers displayed their deeply rooted xenophobic sentiments in their protests and interviews. Unfortunately, this conflict between African Americans and Korean Americans became fueled by the killing of Latasha Hollings that coincided with the Rodney King case in 1991. On March 3rd, 1991, the home video camera finally captured police brutality against a Black man, Rodney King, who was brutally beaten by 4 policemen for speeding. the first televised moving image of police brutality that is prevalent in American society became the visual evidence to fight against the state forced and the state neglected violence against Black citizens. And in less than 2 weeks, on September 16, 1991, we heard another dramatic and sad story that a 15-year-old Latasha Hollins was shot dead, this time by Korean American Sun Ja-do, a convenience store owner in Los Angeles. It was over an orange juice. Sun Ja-do, a woman who toiled her life to survive in the United States, thought that Latasha Hollins was going to rob her place. Latasha Hollins was just grabbing an orange juice. This time, this violent and reversible action was recorded by a security camera at the store. Sun Ja-do's misconduct and voluntary murder after the altercation was sentenced to serve 5-year probation, 400 hours of community service, and pay a $500 fine and the funeral fee for Latasha Hollins. This trial revealed our unjust judicial system that led to suffering of both Korean and Black communities the year after. The frustration and anger are well captured in Ice Cube's hip-hop song, Black Korea, in his 1991 album, Death Certificate. I'm going to play his music here.
Every time I wanna go get a fucking brew, I gotta go down to the store with the two. Only in a 1 penny count, motherfuckers. They make a nigga mad enough to cause a little ruckus. Thinking every brother in the world's out the tape. So they watch every damn move that I make. They hope I don't pull out a gap, try to rob. They funky little store, but bitch, I got a job. You little tight motherfucker ain't crossing on this shit. Leave me alone. Yo, check it out. So don't follow me up and down your market. All your little chop suey ass will be a target of the nationwide boycott. Juice with the people, that's what the boy got. So pay respect to the black fist, or we'll burn your storm right down to a crisp. And then we'll see ya, cause you can't turn to get 'em in the Black Korea. What the fuck you?
All right. So in these lyrics, we textually and rhythmically read the hatred and anger driven by seemingly unresolved and unmanageable tension between xenophobic Black communities and racist Korean communities, as well as a lack of mutual respect. Ice Cube belittles these little Asians by intimidating them and conflate all Asians by refusing to recognize different ethnic groups. The multiplicity and diversity of Asian immigrants from the Chinese laborers who immigrated to the United States in the 19th century to Korean immigrants who settled down in New York after the 1965 Immigration Act. Ice Cube's Black Korea, therefore, musicalizes what we call Black Orientalism that otherizes Koreans, largely Asians, from American imagination and American citizenship. The aggravated Black-Korean relations reached the boiling and then explosive point when Rodney King trial ended up with the acquittal of 3 policemen on April 29th in 1992. Within a few hours, enraged protesters surged into the street in Los Angeles. The police purposely put the guard in the white neighborhood since it was the primary population that LAPD was protecting. Thus, the protest line was directed to Koreatown in Los Angeles. Nope. The pre-existing malfunctioning relationship between Korean American store owners in the Black community, where the rent was more affordable than the other areas, became the major target of anger and frustration as well. White, Black, Koreans are racially triangulated within the power structure and the two oppressed groups, Blacks and Koreans, targeted each other. This disheartening history ended up with people's lives and financial losses. From the Red Apple boycott to the Los Angeles riot, the larger systemic racism that had sustained the United States by disenfranchising Blacks and Asians, and that racism that we people of color internalized left enormous scars on both sides. So there have been many documentary films that captured and retold these stories from multiple points of view. In documentary films, Haigu from 1993, Daishu Kim Gibson, Christine Choi, and Elaine Kim focused on Korean American and Korean immigrant women's perspectives. And then we had a long time of cinematic and television silence and blank that explored the Los Angeles riot. So let's look at a short clip from Saigu that Daishu Kim Gibson made.
반인들의 피해 또는 각 지역에서 발생하는 사건들을 목격하신 분들은 저희 라디오 코리아 520-1300, 520-1300 또는 아파트의 1300으로 제보를 바라겠습니다. 전화를 연결해 보겠습니다. 여보세요? 여보세요? 전화 연결됐습니다. 여보세요? 네, 끊어졌군요. 다음 전화.
그러니까 걔가 라디오를 들으면서 이제 막 흥분하기 시작하는 거예요. 저렇게 우리 한국 사람들이 우리가 이제 온 지가 20년이 되니까 20년 동안 우리가 다 저렇게 읽어놓은 게 저렇게 하루아침에 지금 불타고 그러는데 어떻게 저렇게 바라다 보고 있느냐 그러면서 저기 나가서 다 해야 된다 그 소리예요. 그때 나는 내가 하나밖에 없는 아들인데 얘들을 저 속으로 내가 보낼 수는 없잖아요. 걔 우리를 지켜라. 그러니까 다시 말해서 내 옆에 있어라 그 소리예요. 그랬더니 엄마 같은 사람이 있기 때문에 여기 지금 우리 한국 사람이 이렇게 된다 그거예요. 그러면서 앞으로 10년 있다가 또 이런 사태가 일어났을 때 엄마 같은 사람이 있으면 또 이렇게 당한다면서 이럴 때 지금 나가야지 왜 이러고 앉았느냐고 그래요. 그럴 때 라디오에서 그 당시에 제가 기억하기로는 그 행주산성 얘기를 하더라고요. 그때 그게 무슨 소리냐요. 그게 우리나라 옛날에 저렇게 일본 사람이 쳐들어왔을 때 우리가 여자들도 앞치마에 돌을 싸가지고 날라서 그 행주 앞치마가 그게 행주인데 거기다 돌을 날라서 저기 싸웠기 때문에 그게 지금도 이름이 행주산성이다 그랬더니 그런 것까지 배운 사람이 어떻게 저러고 앉았느냐. 엄마도 나가서 싸워야 된다 그 소리예요.
Our store burned down to ground.
All right, so after this documentary, we had a long history of silence that talked about Los Angeles riot. However, in 2017, we saw the surge of cinematic reproduction of the Los Angeles riot, or now we call April 29th uprising, from different angles. And those include the National Geographic's LA 92, Smithsonian Channel's The Lost Tape, Los Angeles riot, and sorry for my language for this one, Showtime's Burn, Mother F, Burn, and then A&E's LA Burning, the riot 25 years later, and ABC's Let It Fall, Los Angeles 1982 to 1992. So it is noteworthy that these documentary films were not only made to commemorate what happened in the 1990s and the Los Angeles riot, but also to make a comment on the current moment when police brutality still continues to haunt and traumatize the Black community in the United States. So these documentaries incorporate news clips, rare footages, pictures, radio broadcast archives, interweaved with the talking head interviews to recount the stories of first-hand experiences to give a dose of reality. Out of all filmic recreation of the Los Angeles riot, the most far-sighted movie would be Gook, that visually presents the untold, intimate, conflicted, and even solidified relationships between Blacks and Koreans. In this fictional movie, two brothers, Eli and Daniel, run the shoe store in the Black community where their father first built this small business while nurturing an 11-year-old African-American, Camilla. So let me play the scene from this fictional movie.
Is there anything else that I can help you with?
Yes, I'd like to see.
Hi, do you need help with that, man?
Yeah, can I get these in a size 8?
Camilla,
Huh?
DKJ 786.
DKJ, okay,
786. It'll just be a couple of moments.
Busy today, huh?
DKJ 746,
786.
86.
Jesus.
Am I off help over here?
How's your day going?
Hey, just give me a couple minutes. will you?
Catch.
Hey,
What's wrong with you?
VVJ 459. VVJ 459.
BBJ 459, got
How you doing today, man?
See how they feel.
Yeah, she's our little helper.
BBJ 459.
All right. Could you watch the counter, please?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ain't it wrong to have such a young girl employed by the neighborhood?
She's adopted.
Yeah, she's half Korean, half black.
I'm being held here against my own will.
All right, so in this scene captures untold stories of intimacy between Blacks and Koreans, unlike the news reports and various footages that we have seen and heard in most documentary films that only focus on the conflict between Blacks and Koreans. And at the same time, this fictional film does not shy away from telling the truth that how Black, specifically Black women represented by Camilla's mother and Camilla, become the victims of violence. Black women are exposed not only to police brutality, but also to gun violence, domestic violence, and the Korean ignorance and misconduct, similar to Sun Ja-doo's killing of Latasha Hillings. So at the same time, the director Justin Chun, who plays Eli in this film, makes the trustworthy comment on Korean struggle in the Black community and the white-centered United States, where Korean Americans are marked as permanent aliens. On a daily basis, they fight for their basic rights as recognizable citizens of the nation. The new and younger generation, like Eli and Daniel in this film, are in double struggles in which they fight against the racism and xenophobia that they are experiencing in the larger American society on the one hand. At the same time, they are in conflict with their own Korean community and family members who have internalized white supremacy and anti-Black sentiment. So although the film did not give us a solution, this fictional recreation of the story actually becomes a window to look at and get to the truth beyond the factual information we have received that solely focused on the conflict. In that sense, this film is a kind gesture that educates us about race and racism in a global scale at our present moment. So I would like to go back to the starting point of my presentation that we talked about the George Floyd case and global Black Lives Matter movement. In 2020, 28 years have passed since the Los Angeles riot. However, we have not broken this cycle and the pattern of violence against the Black community and largely people of color. The technology allowed us to visually and virally post the unjust videos. However, the anger over police brutality and overt and covert racism are simply translated into violent unrest or vandalism. The grim familiarity continued this week, caused by the police's killing of Walter Wallace Jr., a 27-year-old man with a mental illness in Philly. The call for justice continued days and nights this week, but Korean media's depiction of it failed to deliver the sentiments and the underlying issues that led people to action. JD of the regeneration movement generously shared the news clip with me from Yeonam News that minimized the cause and effect of the death of Walter Wallace in its effort to deliver the agony of Korean beauty supply merchants. Then now we are left with lingering questions to think as a collective group to eradicate global racism and violence while keeping human dignity and inspire coalition. On the one hand, media outlets and the platforms need to be more responsible to deliver a nuanced version that encompasses both Black and Korean camped histories, situations, and agonies. On the other hand, we, as global citizens, are left with our own responsibility to respond back to this wrongful discrimination and antagonism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joo Young Lee. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to remind everyone, while you listen to the presentations tonight, please feel free to be sending questions in the chat. I know there's a lot of information to process, but we are going to be looking at the chat and seeing all of your questions and addressing them later as well. So I encourage you to use the chat to ask your questions and be doing that through our next presentation as well from Dr. Jenny Wong Medina. And I will let her take the floor.
Okay, hi everyone. Sorry, I'm in a time loss because I tend to ramble. So thank you very much, Mary, for that introduction. I'd like to thank Yi-Ching and Oscar and Sean as well, the organizers of this great event. And I'm so excited to see all of you here. This is a huge turnout. Not crowds that I normally draw, but I'd like to thank also Regeneration and the East Asian Collective, and especially Jongdae and Grace for all your hard work, and Dr. Joo Young Lee, sorry, I just want to call her Dr. Joo Young, for that excellent introduction and really comprehensive history of the Korean Black conflict in the US. So I'm going to share my screen now. I have a lot of images that I'm going to go through fairly quickly, just so that we can get it all in there, but bear with me, please. Okay, I also don't know if I can, okay, that's exciting. I didn't know if I'd be able to see without, oh, yep, I don't know what's happening, sorry. Hold on 1 second. I'm having technical difficulties as usual, and I can't find my mouse. There it is. Oops. Oops. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, let's try this again. Here we go. Once again, I'm just going to leave this the way it is. So what you're looking at here is a photograph I took at a beauty supply convention in July of 2019, I believe. For those of you who have ever been to a Korean event, you may be familiar with the beautiful flower arrangements with the like heartfelt messages of support. But I counterpose this with the banner that they have for this beauty trade industry show that has, you know, a Black woman, kind of light skin in this picture, but a Black woman with, you know, this kind of long hair, which is the target customer base for this industry, where Dr. Lee talked about the kind of broader history of these interactions. I'm going to really focus in on the beauty supply and ethnic hair industry. And when I say ethnic hair, this really means weaving hair, braids, the kind of hair that gets attached to your body that these days is mostly an African-American clientele. But as I'll discuss, that has not historically been the case. So this is a very typical ethnic hair and beauty supply store in the US. How did I get involved in this? My family owns several of these, and I grew up in one of these stores. So I've watched this interaction my entire life, and being the nerd that I am, I started thinking about this in the way that I do. So, but I've really seen this interaction change over time, and I've lived through the LA riots and all these things. So it's a space, as Dr. Lee talked about, of real intimacy. This kind of space where people are dealing with their own conceptions of self and the way they look and the way they portray themselves to the world is so important personally, but as well to the community, and with you know, a very individualized identity at the same time that it's a commercial space. So it's a very interesting space to understand the relationship between Korean retail store owners and Black customers. I think even more so than, say, a grocery store or a liquor store or something like this, because it is such an intimate space and something that, like, maybe people don't want to talk about their beauty habits to everyone, right? But in this space, you kind of have to. And it is very heavily gendered at the same time, because these are mostly women who are coming into these spaces. So again, this is a typical beauty supply store if you've never seen one before. I guess typical for a very large one. Here's another image. You can see all the hair and various things that they're selling. As Dr. Lee mentioned, there has been, again, some tension that has flared up. And this is Philadelphia, was this yesterday or the day before? And this is a beauty supply store. And you see these people in the foreground, and a kind of elderly Korean man and woman. And I think for those of you who are familiar with Korea or images of Korea, they look very typical for elderly Koreans. This is kind of a heartbreaking image to see their store was looted. These images are images that my brother sent me today. He now took over my parents' beauty supply, and he received these images from a salesperson who works for a Korean wig company, who received these photographs from a beauty supply owner in Philadelphia. So when I called my brother this morning to ask him, like, what do you think about what's going on? And he sent me these images. Oh, no, excuse me. Sorry. How did you get in here? My cat just walked in. Sorry. Please get out. Thank you. So how do we get from here to here, and then think about how we can not repair this relationship, but think about how this relationship works in order to understand how we can approach some sort of understanding, or I don't know, some sort of better relationship. Certainly this is not the only business that got looted in Philadelphia. The Walmart was targeted, I think Target, even Lord and Taylor or something like this. But this really plays into a larger history of relationships between minority communities that have both seen exclusion in the US by, through systemic racism. How does this work through hair? I'll get there. So I'm going to go back a little bit to why the wig industry. So here's, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dolly Parton, but she seems to have resonance with a lot of different generations. So this is Dolly's wig line, and it's made through Revlon. That's a huge multinational conglomerate, right? And on the left side, you have an image of an advertisement for wigs from the 60s or 70s. So in the 60s and 70s, wigs were very popular, not just with Black women. The human hair trade was a huge thing. But most of this hair came from Asia. The hair that they used to make wigs came from Asia, predominantly from Hong Kong in the early 60s. After the Korean War and during the rebuilding of South Korea, the textile industry becomes one of the very important industries in South Korea, and they start making wigs. Korean people have good hair, right? It's the kind of hair that you can bleach, dye, do whatever to, and works pretty well. So they both had like the supply. They also had the growing textile industry to make these wigs. In addition to this, the US starts a tariff on, or they ban hair from communist China, which means although Hong Kong has not yet been ceded back to China, it's still like Chinese hair, and so it suffers. Their industry suffers, while South Korea gains from this because they're an ally country, and it's good hair in the sense that it's not communist hair. So at this time, wigs are kind of expensive, and they're coming from Korea and Hong Kong, but this is really when the growth happens in Korea. But as you may know, people stop wearing wigs. Most people stop wearing wigs, but Black women still wear human hair. These are images from factory protests in South Korea. You see, these are mostly women who are working in these factories, and they are very important to the labor movement in Korea in the 70s and 80s. So you can see too that these wigs don't come from an apoliticized space. They come from a place where there are problems associated with the product that they're manufacturing, and that then, you know, go back to America in this kind of form where we really don't see the problems that come from it, right? Sometimes we forget that this is where Korea comes from, maybe, because we see, you know, the Korean dream, we see K-pop stars. They now wear this hair again. The hair no longer comes from Korea. I can talk about that in the Q&A. So the beauty supply industry doesn't only do hair, they now do products as well. So we see these kinds of products. I have here Madam C.J. Walker. She's the first African-American female millionaire. She had a hair preparation, but we can see kind of the changing stuff that is used. At the bottom right, this is made by a Korean company, and it's like edge gel for like this part of your hair. But we can see how the images that are used appeal to a lot of different sensibilities and different kind of aesthetic qualities, right? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. So talking about this industry in the media, I don't know how many of you have seen this, but Chris Rock did a documentary about this same subject. It's called Good Hair. He goes into mostly India to talk about where the hair is sourced from, which is a new place. Historically, the hair came from East Asia. Now it comes from mostly Southeast Asia and South Asia. There was another documentary made, this is the one on the right, called Black Hair, the Korean Takeover. This is a somewhat inflammatory film. You can find it on YouTube if you're interested. And it really tries to demonize the Korean business owners. Although the history of this Korean business or of the retailers is such that because they had the connection to the wholesalers, they did have a platform for selling these things, right? It coincides with the first major wave of immigration of Korean immigrants to the US. So in the mid 60s, early 70s, a lot of Koreans are moving to the US after the 1965 immigration and naturalization laws. So you have all these new immigrants, for one whose actual, or maybe whose education and skills are not recognized here. So many of them go into retail and small business ownership and entrepreneurship. On the other hand, or second, I shouldn't say on the other hand, they are connected to these wholesalers, and they come from a place where these products are coming from. So there's a linguistic capability that they have in interacting with the kind of broader system, the broader supply chain. How do they get into starting to do this? They continue in this business, such as my parents started in 1971, selling wigs at a flea market, like 10 wigs a week or something like this. But my uncle was an exporter, so they did have a supply chain. Like I can track this personally for I don't know, many reasons, but what I can say is that the roots are much deeper than this, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make that pun. But this is an industry with a long history that has to do with the US Cold War involvement. as well as interethnic tensions, white flight from certain neighborhoods, and the introduction of like this new group of immigrants who are willing to work in this space. So we have these documentaries. We also have this, on the other hand, a media representation. This is an industry trade magazine. It may seem strange that all of the words are in Korean, but it's a Black woman on the cover. This is really for beauty supply owners to track fads and trends in Black hair. So if you look into it, you'll see there are explanations about what Black Lives Matter is. Does it matter to us? How can we do? Will they think, I was just reading some of these articles, will they think that we're just pandering to them? And these are concerns that these actual business owners have. You may say that this is only to promote their business, but there are real social questions that are involved here. When you get to the level of day-to-day interaction, it's not necessarily about these broad social implications. When you ask these people, they may say, why are they looting? But on the other hand, they will also say, these people are my customers and I know them at a very, very intimate level. I know them closely. Like my parents, for example, went to church with some of their customers, and my parents are very religious. But my dad comes back and says, wow, my customers, they really have the joy of Jesus in their heart. He said, wow, Dad, I was very surprised that they were willing to do this sort of thing. But there are ways that they can bridge this kind of relationship and understand at a personal level, which is how we can get out from this, right? So I'm going to show you a couple of, I think I'm almost out of time, but a couple of images. This is from the industry event that I went to, that I start this presentation with. And you can see how the imagery plays on, it uses Korean celebrities as well as Black celebrities. Vivica A. Falk has a huge line of hair. Excuse me. But at the same time, K-beauty has now been introduced into this market. And there is, sorry, if you see this thing that says Blackpink, this is a beauty line that became kind of popular, that I don't know that all of the customers know who Blackpink is, but it's certainly playing on this kind of imagery that goes back and forth. So now this kind of circular imagery is happening between Korean popular culture and Black culture, right? Sorry, where is this? Okay, so this is also there. I love this. There's a show on the left, on the top left, you see these women they did like a dance and then they're modeling the hair. And these are almost the only Black women who were at this trade convention. Almost everybody else was Korean. You can see here on the right, they also have Korean performers. This was during lunch. Everyone's like eating kimbap and like watching this stuff happen. I don't know why I included, oh, this guy. He just seems like he's channeling Steve Jobs. So I kind of like that. He's also trying to incorporate this kind of social messaging into the hair company that he owns. And then here are some representatives for Asian Americans advancing justice. I was happy to see them there, but this is also a space where they're for outreach. There are a lot of Korean American shop owners there, and I've seen them now at a couple of different events, which I think is very heartening. So to go back, this is an image from the video that JD shared with us to this yesterday about the riots in Philadelphia. And this comes from Yonhap News, a Korean news source. And it says that Korean businesses are targeted again. This kind of inflammatory rhetoric is very dangerous. If you look at the what is that called? The comment section, it's pretty inflammatory, but it's probably not good to look at any comment section in anything, because that tends to be where the crazies hang out. In any case, how this reflects globally is kind of, it's disheartening to look at this sort of thing, but at the same time, it's very important for us to be mindful of how these images circulate. This image is the same image I showed you at the beginning, this one, which is still heartbreaking to see this sort of thing. But the context of this with the captioning really focuses in on the plight of Korean Americans or Koreans in America. It doesn't even say like Kyopo, so it doesn't say like Korean Americans, it says like Korean peoples businesses are being targeted. This is a way to sow strife, not to consider kind of the history that goes into this business and the interactions that happen there. So kind of panning out, it's still a sad picture, but I don't know, where do we go from here? And this is a question really for you guys to consider and for you to work with. I will just provide the context, hopefully. So that is all for today. Thank you very much for inviting me to this talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wang Medina, for that amazing talk and all of the pictures that you showed us. They're so interesting. And I'm so happy you were able to bring in the events from yesterday as well, because I know that happened very recently. And that's something I hope that we would be able to talk about tonight. So thank you all for posting questions in the chat. We're going to go into our Q&A now. And let's begin with a question that came up in the chat a little bit ago. So how does whiteness play a role in the contentious relationship between Black and diasporic Korean communities, especially in promoting covert and disguised or veiled racism? Doesn't the media pieces described in your presentations promote simplistic knowledge of Korean victimization and play a dangerous role of perpetuating the violence and death in the Black community? And this is referring to Dr. Joo Young Lee's images in her presentation specifically, but I think we can all discuss this topic as well.
Yeah, I think it was Christian from Young-oh, right? Oh, hi Young-oh. So I mean, as we all know, lots of media representations before really focused on, especially Korean media, really focused on the victimization of Koreans in this Los Angeles riot or in general. And that continued in the time of Black Lives Matter, especially in 2020. We continuously saw how Korean media depicted the Koreans as the victims of Black Lives Matter movement. And as Jenny Wang, Dr. Wang Medina showed us a little bit of a clip from Yeonhap News, it played it again this week. However, I felt like Gook was a little bit different from other documentary films and the news report, because it really navigated different dimensions. So here, Koreans are not necessarily the only victims. They are seen as the perpetrators and the racists who are exercising the violence and who went into the Black community to take advantage of their money, finance, and their labor at the same time, not giving back to the community. So Gook was more nuanced, but as Young-oh pointed out in his comment, that's right. At the end, what we lose is Camilla, Black, young woman. So I think we need to think about who is the last victim in this story continuously. And whenever we think about whiteness, this is racial triangulation. I'm talking about racial triangulation, like white always on the top, and then in the bottom, we have Koreans and the Black together. They are always in the opposite side, where whiteness is keeping all the power structure in terms of education, real estate, the finance, and all the civil rights. So white is always on the top, keeping their own rights, while Koreans and Blacks are always in the opposite. And I'm really not sure how we can break this pattern and the cycle. So I want to actually ask Young-oh back, because you're also an expert in this field. I wonder what would be the way for us to break this cycle?
First of all, thank you for the amazing presentation. And yeah, I think the great thing about both the representation is that there is no answer, and I think it's a process of figuring it out. And for me, the question stemmed from when you talked about how this is also, there's a xenophobia of the Black community and the racism of Koreans, and those basically stem from whiteness, and this also kind of came up from like what I've been seeing in the media of like you know, like in LA, Cape Town, you know, like there were like demonstrations where we see African drums and Pomo drums together in a very powerful moment of solidarity. At the same time, there's this regurgitation of the rooftop Korean narrative, where basically, Professor Wang Medina's presentation reminded me of this because it's a very much a transnational issue where Koreans who received military training in South Korea, who moved to LA, who protected their basically stores with the military training, but at the same time, it has a very much a notion of whiteness in it, you know, white masculinity, where like after the George Floyd shooting, these white militants were constantly regurgitating the Korean rooftop narrative, where these are the real Americans who protect their land. And you know, what's disheartening is we see forms of solidarity, and we also see, you know, like Koreans who are very much appeased by that notion of Korean men being masculine and protecting their land. And I feel like that's also very relevant to the emasculation of Asian males in a sense too, in that, you know, like they have weapons and they can protect themselves. So there's this like really weird multiplicity of identity formations across the Korean diaspora, where we do see powerful forms of solidarity and we do see blatant forms of racism. And are there ways to balance that ideal where it's very, very transgenerational too? You know, we see the youth more converging in this notion of solidarity, where the more elderly and conservative are kind of leaning towards those areas. So I kind of see it from like the perspective of the Korean community, where is there a way to kind of like bring these ideas together? And you know, I'm very not optimistic person in that I don't see a way where, you know, these different ideas of race can be bridged together. So yeah, I wonder what anyone else thinks about this question as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Would either of the speakers like to respond, or also there's a follow-up, or there's a question in the chat I see from Michelle Cho that asks, can both presenters talk a bit more about class? I think there may need to be a more nuanced discussion of the class distinctions between Korean small business owners who have a certain access to capital despite other forms of disenfranchisement, and their inner city Black customers. The immigrant bootstraps narrative tends to flatten this class distinction, and the Korean victim narrative in media sources tends to rely on the model minority myth.
Yeah, I can answer that. Hi, Michelle. But also, these are the notes that I was taking down. I specifically wrote down model minority and class. So I'm glad that this question got asked. Yes, so there is this idea of the bootstrap narrative, right? That immigrants come and they're willing to work very hard in order to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, or whatever this narrative is, and work hard in order to achieve this American dream. But why don't these Black people do it? Why don't they try to do this as well? This really ignores the fact that a lot of these immigrants who do come with some amount of capital, enough, or at least they come into a situation where there is collective capital. So there are kind of ways that they can get into this industry, perhaps working initially in one of these stores like my parents own, and then learning about the business from another Korean person. There are these kind of minority networks. You can see this as well if you look into like the donut shop industry in Southern California. There's this huge like empire of donut shops, and it's kind of it's related to chain migration, not just in the form of families, but in the form of business opportunities. Like I mentioned before, there was the access to the wholesaling from Korea, that the products that people were eventually selling came from Korea. So there's another pipeline, right? The kind of business associations that I showed, everything's in Korean because they own this industry. And the reason they continue to own it is because there's constant immigration. There are still more and more new immigrants coming who will fill these roles. This has changed in a lot of other immigrant groups. as they experience kind of white flight or movement into whiteness, which Koreans don't do. Asian Americans do not move into whiteness in the same way that other groups do. So there is this kind of constant minoritization of Asian immigrants, even as they are constantly repressed. I'll stop there and let Dr. Lee answer this as well if she'd like to. Or not.
I think Dr. Wang Medina actually talked the most part that I wanted to talk. But at the same time, I mean, the modern minority myth, it just continued in the clip that Dr. Wang Medina showed at the end in the Yeonam News. So we could not play it because it's in Korean. However, in this clip, it continued this modern minority narrative that these hardworking Korean immigrants or Korean Americans in downtown Philly are making their lives in this street. However, the ones who could not assimilate to American dream, hardworking dream, are demolishing the ones who made it. So I think that clip just captured all the modern minority myth that continues and how the Korean Americans have been part of this narrative to fortify whiteness and the middle class American dream story.
Thank you so much for that. So moving towards another area of questions, someone asked, we have seen the rise of anti-racist movements in East Asian countries thanks to social media. But it could be said that there is a lack of these mobilizations in the Asian diaspora within the United States. How would you explain this phenomena? Personally, as someone from an urban area, Queens, New York, I've noticed that oftentimes the Korean and Black communities are in a way segregated and lead completely different lives. Does this serve as an impediment to interracial dialogue?
Jenny, you're from New York. Do you want to go ahead first to talk about?
I'm actually from California. But I can't, well, I don't know. I think you might be better equipped to talk about this. I can just talk about my own experience a little bit, and kind of where these impediments might come from is at this granular level of day-to-day interaction, where if you think about kind of, if you look at it holistically, it's very difficult to say like where the racism comes from because it comes from both sides. There is a lot of distrust in both communities. And when you are thinking about where these Korean businesses are, they're often in communities that are underserved in other ways, in terms of social services, in terms of education, in terms of, I don't know, food even. So the kind of distrust that is bred in those spaces, and the fact that many of these Korean business people don't live in those communities also makes it harder for there to be any sort of understanding. And I'm sorry, I'm not answering the question. I would say that there are terrible interactions that happen on a day-to-day basis. Things, you know, it's the Ice Cube video that that Dr. Lee showed talks about following people down the aisles and things like that. And this is seen as a racist attack or as a racialized form of interaction. But if you were to ask somebody like my mother, for example, she would say, I follow the people who have shoplifted before, but not everyone. And it sounds like, you know, an excuse sometimes, and then it sounds like totally reasonable at other times because these are things that happen. There is overhead, but that's very difficult to consider when it becomes a blanket policy, for example. Sorry, I'm not sure that answered the question, but it's something.
I mean, there are multiple points we can make. So first, there is Black Lives Matter movements that happen worldwide, not only within the United States, but in Asia, including Korea. However, as I presented in the beginning of my talk, that does not mean there is no anti-Black sentiment anymore in those areas. It still continues. Blackface still resurfaces in every bit of hip-hop music video or the comedy television shows, all of those things. So yes, there is a widespread awareness of racism happen beyond the American border, but that is still happening everywhere. Second, in terms of this conflict between African American communities and not only Korean, but largely Asian American communities or Asian immigrants, that go back to the 19th century when there was a number of Asian immigrants enter into the United States, and then they became indentured laborers or gold miners. They became the ones who were taking economic benefits. At the same time, African Americans were disenfranchised as American citizens, such as voting rights. So if you look at the 19th century Black press, actually in the Black press, they wanted Asian immigrants out of the United States. So if you look at American history, it was a fighting over this rights and the citizenship, access to education, healthcare, food, all of those things. These little things were putting minorities in opposite side and fight against each other, while as Joo Young Lee pointed out, this patriarchy, white-centered rhetorics were holding American dream and American narrative and the power structure. So I think that's the second point we need to figure out. It is not only a recent one, but it has the history in the United States. And third, what's really sad about is that whenever there is violence upon Black persons in the United States, it involves many Asian persons. So if you look at the New York's case, Peter Liang involved in the shooting of Black man. If you look at the George Floyd case, of course, Hmong American involved in the case. So it is unfortunate that how Asian Americans always involved in these cases, and what it is important in our generation is that we need to figure out how to get away from this circle of oppression Olympics and then find a way to solidify each other for greater human dignity, because we are fighting for human dignity not only within our nation, but in a global sense.
Can I just add one more thing? I've been reading some of the other questions, and I think this will address some of this as well. Thinking about the global, or kind of the rise of anti-racist movements in East Asia, I was struck by this idea that this is really a question of human rights and minority rights, right? And human rights issues have become a huge flashpoint in Asia, and particularly in South Korea. They have like the National Human Rights Commissions and things like that. Whereas in the US, the way this is talked about is often in terms of minority identity, where human rights are considered maybe a universal thing, and minority identity is kind of separate from that. How I would want to talk about that is perhaps that East Asian movements for solidarity are thinking about these in terms of kind of the universalism of humanism or of human rights. But when it comes down to day-to-day interactions on the ground in minority communities, this is a very different interaction that happens. And so the conflict arises in different ways in kind of in this kind of interaction that is very not abstract at all. Right? Human rights is very abstract, and this is an issue, or this is an idea that has gained a lot of traction in Asia and particularly in Korea. But there is a disconnect, especially because in Korea, Korean people are not a minority, right? So they only discover that they are a minority when they get here. So there is this kind of shift that happens, and this kind of minority identity is something that's thrust upon people who don't come from a place where they are minorities. So maybe this model of minority idea or the kind of alignment with a kind of white-centric viewpoint has something to do with coming from a position of dominance already, particularly people who have the capital to come here, and often they're very well educated, and they don't come from they don't necessarily come from an oppressed class. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much for your insights on those questions. Those are such important topics. I'm very glad we got to talk about that. So we only have time for just a couple more questions tonight. But before I ask my final couple of questions, I would like to ask if Dr. Wang Medina and Dr. Joo Young Lee, if you have anything that you would like to say in regards to some of the questions that have come up in the chat, or just reflections on what we've discussed so far tonight.
I'm the loudmouth, so I'll start. I'm so heartened to see all these amazing questions. These are great, fantastic questions. I wish we could stay another hour to talk about all of this stuff. And if you have questions, feel free to email me. My information is on the Emory website. American imperialism, gender interactions, all of these things are so important to understanding how communities interact with each other. And I just want to thank you all for doing the work that you're doing, and keep it up.
Yeah, I piggyback Dr. Wang Medina. If you have any comments or other questions, you can find me on Michigan website and send me an email as well.
Thank you so much for your willingness to communicate with everyone. I know that I have a lot of things to talk about, so I might be emailing you as well. So the second to last question that someone posed in the chat is, how should platforms be responsible for racist or discriminatory comments? Would it violate freedom of speech to censor this? And this question also connects to another question that came up, which is, how should we as consumers of everyday media approach and deal with certain platforms in order to better and more accurately understand the relationship between Black and Korean communities surrounding the issue of racial justice and understanding of global communities extending beyond the select communities in the United States?
I mean, do you think we need to invite Dr. Michelle Cho here to talk about this?
I was going to say the same thing. Since she's here, but I don't know if she wants to talk. Michelle, do you want to say something about this? Oh, she missed the question, Mary. Can you say it again?
Yeah, sure. So there are two questions that are kind of connected. The first is, how should platforms be responsible for racist and discriminatory speech? And the second is, how should we as consumers of everyday media approach and deal with certain platforms in order to better and more accurately understand the relationship between Black and Korean communities surrounding the issues of racial justice and understanding of global communities extending beyond these select communities in the United States?
Hi. I guess I could say a couple things. I mean, I'm sorry to intrude, but I've been thinking a lot about the platform issue because it's something that I kind of study. And I don't know if people have been paying attention to what's been going on this week in the news in terms of hearings that have been taking place with the heads of Google, Facebook, and Twitter. I mean, there's some questioning about why Republican senators are trying to get these CEOs to say something about the responsibility that platforms have at the moment, and they maybe sort of nefarious political motivations to help the Republicans. But putting that aside, it's nevertheless always a concern for American legislators and for all of us really, global users of these platforms, to think about how we can hold them responsible if they're responsible. And they always weasel out of responsibility by claiming that they are just the hosts. They should not be held accountable, and they have no responsibility to moderate the content in any way. And that, I think, is a cop-out because they also use the content that's presented in order to make money, with advertising and also with data collection on their users. And so we as users should, I think, empower ourselves a bit more to demand more responsibility from these platforms. If you're going to take from me, if you're going to monetize my attention somehow and make money off the eyes that, you know, you're drawing to your platform, then you should take more responsibility. So that's maybe something that we can do as consumers. I think that platforms also have a real, I mean, kind of an unprecedented potential to allow people to converse on topics, even if they aren't in the same geographical space. And that is one of the reasons why platforms have become so powerful, is because we can take conversations and we can instantaneously exchange ideas with people who are outside of our locality. And we should use that for, you know, education, to educate each other, especially on these issues, to take this momentum that we have from the summer to build on anti-racist movements and to talk to our friends who don't live in the North American context, to give them more information about you know, the kind of state of systemic racism in North America, how that has been spread globally through American imperialism, the reasons why, you know, we see anti-Blackness take sort of familiar forms in a lot of places, and especially in the parts of East Asia that are under the purview of the US military empire. And so we can really use these platforms in positive ways to hopefully inform each other, because we all have different areas of knowledge, areas of experience. And so we can't really deal with this problem as a single group. We have to kind of bring in all sorts of voices and come up with solutions that will be based on the expertises that we all bring respectively to this topic. It's not just the responsibility of one community or another. It's like this kind of opening up and admitting that I don't have the experience that, you know, someone else may have, and so therefore I have to give over that part of my thinking to some other knowledge that other people can bring. That's, I think, where I stand. Yeah.
Thank you so much for weighing in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cho. Oh my goodness. I didn't expect to have 3 amazing guest speakers tonight, but I'm so glad we have. Thank you. And 2 amazing cats. It's so we have one final question that we have time for, though. Thank you. I want to thank everyone for the incredible questions that you have posed that have hit really at the center of the themes that we're discussing and the relevant issues. So thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for your questions. And I will end with a question that came up much earlier in the chat, which is, do you think that there could ever be some form of unification or understanding or productive engagement between the Korean and Black communities?
Mary, if you do not mind, could you repeat the question?
Sure. So the question is, do you think that there could ever be some form of unification or understanding between the Korean and Black communities?
I think there is understanding at a granular level, maybe at an individual level. The question is of education, as well as, gosh, well, I don't have an answer for this. I have many thoughts, but no answers. I'm optimistic, particularly as we get into the 2nd and 3rd generation of Asian Americans. But I don't have prescriptions for this. I think the best we can do is continue to learn and share information with each other, as well as, I was going to add to what Dr. Cho had said earlier. My initial response to the question of how to use platforms is to be distrustful. But after listening to her, I was also going to say, not to be distrustful, but actually learn how to read, to learn how to understand what you are consuming, right? And to be mindful and analytical about it. So save the humanities. Sorry, I didn't mean to end there, but.
I mean, unification between Black and Korean communities. I am not so sure about the larger scale, but on a daily basis or human interactions that we have in our small settings and the communities, it's already happening. So for example, when I was attending undergraduate school, long time ago, long time ago, I involved in the minority group who are invested in the diversity issues on campus and beyond. And we started to have talk over coffee, over a meal. And then they asked me questions like, do Asians receive racism? And I said, yeah. So I shared my stories with my Black friends. At the same time, I learned Black history, their struggle, their agonies by listening to them. And then in that way, we built our community, we created our coalitions, and that continues because I am now in academia. My friends are in politics or in academia right now. And we continue because we learned from each other what kind of experience we have. And as Dr. Wang Medina shared, her parents, her family, they build a community within that setting continuously on a daily basis. We cannot just treat the business as the merchants and the customers, but people share feelings, intimacy, all of other feelings and daily basis, daily lives. So therefore, I do think we are already creating the unification between Black and Korean communities. It's just in the 21st century, as Dr. Cho said, we actually have the power and the choice how to control the social media and the public outlets. So I think it's our now chance and the opportunity to change the larger rhetorics and the narratives.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, and love that we're ending on this, I believe, very hopeful note, because I think the fact that we, even this group of people is coming together to discuss these sort of questions and think about these very difficult topics is telling of how understanding is built on a local level and in between individuals. And it's something that I believe can be very powerful. And I am so happy that even in the small space, we've had so many people here and been able to hear all these different thoughts tonight. And I would like to thank everyone so much again for coming. I know it's late and I am thrilled that we were able to have such a fruitful discussion. I would like to thank also the Overseas Koreans Foundation again for sponsoring this event. And if you have any questions, I believe that both Dr. Jenny Wang Medina and Dr. Joo Young Lee are happy to be in communication with you via email. And we hope to see you again at our events in the future. So thank you all so much.
Before we end, can everybody turn on their camera and take a group picture?
Thank you, Mary.